A funeral is a time of grief, a time to say goodbye. But on this particular day, something unexpected happened. As mourners gathered around the coffin, a massive bear emerged from the woods. Fear gripped everyone. But what happened next left them speechless. What would you do if a wild bear walked into a funeral? Would you run, scream, or stand frozen in shock? This is the unbelievable yet true story of a bear who showed up to a funeral and did something no one could have ever imagined. The air was thick with grief. The overcast sky seemed to mirror the sorrow hanging over the small funeral gathering. A gentle breeze rustled the surrounding trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The mourners stood in silence, their gazes fixed on the simple wooden coffin that rested in the center of the cemetery. Among them, a widow clutched a crumpled handkerchief, her hands trembling as she wiped away endless tears. Beside her, a young boy, her grandson, held tightly onto a framed picture of his grandfather, Thomas Reynolds. His small fingers gripped the wooden frame so tightly that his knuckles turned white, as if letting go would somehow erase the man from his memory. Thomas Reynolds had lived a simple life, far removed from the chaos of the modern world. He had never been a man of wealth or fame, never sought recognition or status. Instead, he had chosen solitude, making his home deep within the woods. Some saw him as nothing more than a recluse, a man who preferred trees over people. But those who truly knew him understood that he had a heart full of kindness. He found joy in the smallest details, the morning mist rising over the river, the chirping of birds at sunrise, the sound of leaves crunching beneath his boots as he walked through the forest. Despite his quiet existence, Thomas had not been alone. He had formed a bond with the creatures of the wild, a bond few people ever experienced. And now, as the priest prepared to begin the ceremony, an unexplainable presence would soon make itself known. A sudden rustling came from the trees at the edge of the clearing. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable over the hushed sobs of the mourners. But then, heavy footsteps echoed through the woods. The sound was deep and deliberate, as though something large was moving toward them. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. The widow instinctively gripped her grandson's hand, pulling him closer. Some of the mourners turned, their eyes scanning the tree line in search of the source. Whispers spread among them, nervous and uncertain. Then, emerging from the dense shadows of the forest, it appeared. A massive figure covered in thick, dark fur. A bear. It moved slowly, its enormous paws pressing into the damp earth, leaving imprints in the soft ground. The sheer size of the creature sent waves of fear through the funeral gathering. Gasps filled the air. A man instinctively took a step back, shielding his wife behind him. Another reached into his pocket, fumbling for his phone, perhaps to call for help. The bear's deep brown eyes scanned the crowd before settling on the wooden coffin. It did not growl. It did not charge. It simply walked forward, closing the distance between itself and the final resting place of Thomas Reynolds. The silence was suffocating. Every breath, every heartbeat, every tiny movement seemed magnified in the tension of the moment. Then, something completely unexpected happened. The bear stopped just beside the coffin and lowered itself onto the ground. Its massive body settled, its breathing slow and steady. It did not look at the people surrounding it. It did not react to the whispers of fear. Instead, it placed its enormous head gently against the wooden coffin and let out a deep, mournful sound. It was a sound of sorrow, of loss, of heartbreak. The widow's lips parted in shock, her tears momentarily forgotten. The young boy stared, his small hands trembling as he held the framed picture of his grandfather. The priest, who had been preparing to deliver his sermon, now found himself speechless, the words frozen on his tongue. It was as if the bear understood, as if it had come to say goodbye. For the first time, the fear in the air began to shift, melting away into something deeper, something unspoken, something that did not need explanation. Because this was no ordinary bear. Years ago, Thomas Reynolds had found a helpless bear cub struggling for its life in the river that ran through the forest. The little creature had been swept up in the powerful current, its tiny paws flailing, its desperate cries barely audible over the rushing water. Thomas could have walked away, could have told himself that nature had its own way of deciding fates. But that was not the kind of man he was. Without hesitation, he had stepped into the icy river, wading through the powerful current. He had reached for the cub, pulling it from the water and cradling its tiny, soaked body in his arms. He had saved it. From that day on, they had been inseparable. Thomas had nursed the cub back to health, feeding it, keeping it warm, watching over it as if it were his own child. As the bear grew, so did their bond. It followed him through the woods, sat with him by the lake, and rested beside him under the stars. But Thomas had always known that their time together was temporary. The bear did not belong in a world of walls and fences. It belonged in the wild. And so, one day, with a heavy heart, he had led his friend deep into the forest. He had whispered his goodbyes, and he had walked away, leaving behind a part of his heart. Now, after all those years, the bear had returned, not as a wild animal, not as a beast, but as something more. It had returned as a friend, as family, as a soul mourning the loss of the only human who had ever shown it kindness. The mourners, who had moments ago been terrified, now stood in silent awe. No one dared to move. No one wanted to disturb this powerful moment. It was as if time itself had stopped, allowing this final goodbye to take place. The bear remained there for what felt like an eternity, its head resting against the coffin, its massive body still. The only movement was the slow rise and fall of its breath. Then, after what seemed like forever, the bear lifted its head. It sat there for a moment longer, staring at the coffin, as if memorizing it. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it rose to its feet. It turned and began to walk away, back toward the forest, back to the place where it had come from. The trees swallowed its massive form, and just like that, it was gone. The funeral attendees remained frozen in place. The widow, the priest, the boy, all of them struggled to process what they had just witnessed. This had not just been a funeral. This had been something greater, a testament to love, loyalty, and a bond that even death could not break. Thomas Reynolds had left the world, but his kindness had not been forgotten. Not by his family, not by his friends, and certainly not by the bear who had once been saved by his hands. As the last echoes of the bear's footsteps faded into the forest, the young boy clutched the framed picture tighter to his chest. A single tear rolled down his cheek, because he now understood something he never had before. His grandfather's kindness had not only changed his own life, it had changed the life of a creature many would have feared. It had left an imprint on the world in a way that few ever could. And that, he realized, was the true measure of a great man. As the funeral continued, no one spoke of the bear, because there was no need to. Some moments, some goodbyes, were meant to be felt, not explained. The funeral had a somber air about it, heavy with grief and the quiet sorrow that comes with the loss of a loved one. A small group of mourners stood in a circle around the simple wooden coffin, their faces etched with sadness. Thomas Reynolds, a man who had lived a quiet and humble life in the woods, was being laid to rest, and those who had known him were left to reflect on the life he had lived and the impact he had made. The widow, his wife, was standing closest to the coffin, her hand trembling as she clutched a handkerchief to her tear-streaked face. By her side, the young boy, the grandson, gripped a framed picture of his grandfather, his eyes red from crying, but filled with love and loss. And then, from the edge of the forest, a sound broke the stillness. It was subtle at first, a rustling in the trees, as if a gust of wind had shaken the branches. But then the sound grew louder. The small group of mourners stood silently as the priest prepared to say the final words. The air was thick with the weight of loss, and the steady hum of nature surrounded them, the rustling of the trees in the wind, and the distant call of birds almost serving as an unsettling reminder that the world continued on, indifferent to the grief that had settled in this quiet spot. Thomas Reynolds had lived a peaceful life, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. He had spent most of his time alone in the forest, walking its winding paths, feeding the birds, watching the sunset. He wasn't a man of wealth or status, but those who knew him well could see the depth of his heart. He had a quiet, understated kindness that left a lasting impression on everyone he encountered. Even the trees seemed to stand a little taller in his presence, as if they recognized the goodness in him. But, as with all things in life, Thomas had eventually left the world behind, and his loved ones were now left with memories. The small funeral was a testament to a life lived simply but meaningfully. As the priest spoke, his voice was calm, but the words seemed to fade into the background of everyone's minds. All eyes were focused on the coffin, on the reality of the loss. Heavy footsteps. Each step was distinct and deliberate, and it was clear that something large was moving toward the gathering. The mourners looked at one another in confusion and mild concern. Their eyes darted nervously to the tree line, wondering what could be making such a noise. The priest paused, his voice faltering as he tried to discern the source of the noise. A few of the mourners, uneasy, began shifting on their feet. Some took a step back, instinctively trying to put distance between themselves and whatever was approaching. Others whispered, their voices low and unsure. And then, out of the shadows of the forest, it appeared. A large, dark shape slowly emerged into the clearing, moving with heavy, deliberate steps. The creature's massive size was unmistakable. It was a bear. The bear was enormous, its fur dark and thick, its body powerful and imposing. It moved with the confidence of an animal who belonged in the wild. But there was something different about it. There was no sign of aggression, no sharp growls, no threatening posture. It was simply walking. The crowd gasped. A woman let out a startled cry and instinctively pulled her child closer to her, while another man put a protective arm around his wife. There was an immediate surge of fear that rippled through the group. Bears were not common in this area, and their appearance at a funeral was certainly an unexpected and unsettling one. The mourners couldn't help but feel a primal sense of danger. The instinct to run, to protect themselves, was there, but they stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The bear stopped a few feet from the group, standing still for a moment. Its eyes scanned the mourners, as if assessing them. The bear's gaze was steady, calm, yet there was an undeniable sadness in its eyes. It was an expression no one could have anticipated from a wild animal, especially one of such size and strength. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The sound of the wind, the rustling of the leaves, and the soft sobs of the widow were the only things that filled the air. The bear did not charge or threaten anyone. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging the solemnity of the moment. Then, slowly, the bear moved closer to the coffin. Every eye in the crowd was fixed on the creature, watching in disbelief as it approached the final resting place of Thomas Reynolds. The bear's massive paws made no sound as they pressed into the earth, its movements graceful despite its size. It reached the coffin and, to the surprise of everyone present, lowered its head. The bear's head came to rest gently against the wooden surface of the coffin. Its breathing was slow and steady, almost as if it were mourning, sharing in the grief of those present. It did not make a sound, but there was an unmistakable sense of connection between the bear and the coffin, between the bear and the man lying within it. At that moment, the fear that had initially gripped the mourners began to dissipate. The bear wasn't a threat. It wasn't there to attack. It was there to pay its respects. The mourners, in their shock and disbelief, slowly began to realize that the bear was mourning the loss of someone. It was as if it had come to say goodbye to the man who had once saved its life. The mourners stood in stunned silence as they watched the bear lower its head, resting it gently against the coffin. The widow, the grandson, the priest, and all the others present stood in awe of this unexpected tribute. The world seemed to stop for a moment, and there was a sense of peace in the air. The bear stayed by the coffin for what felt like an eternity, as if it was sharing the grief of those who had loved Thomas. Years ago, Thomas Reynolds had come across a small bear cub struggling in a river. The water was fast, the current strong, and the cub was struggling to keep its head above the surface. Without thinking, Thomas had waded into the icy water and pulled the cub to safety. The tiny creature had been weak and vulnerable, and Thomas had cared for it, nursing it back to health. The bond between man and animal had formed that day, and it had grown as the cub turned into a mighty bear. Thomas had been the bear's protector, its friend, and its guardian. Over time, the bear had grown stronger, more independent. But there was a bond, a connection, that could not be severed. Even as the bear grew wild, it never forgot the man who had saved its life. It had returned to the place where it had been nurtured, where it had received love and care. And now, on the day of Thomas Reynolds' funeral, it had come back to say goodbye. And then, after what seemed like hours, the bear slowly raised its head. It turned and began to walk away, disappearing back into the forest from which it had emerged. The mourners, still in shock, watched as the large creature melted into the shadows of the trees. The silence that followed was profound. The widow stood, her hand still clutching the handkerchief, tears flowing freely now. The boy, his eyes wide and filled with wonder, looked at the place where the bear had stood, as if trying to understand the significance of what he had just witnessed. The priest stood still, his sermon forgotten. What words could he offer now that had any meaning? What could he say after witnessing such a moment? The bear's appearance had been a reminder of the bonds that could be formed between man and nature, between creatures of the wild and those who showed them kindness. The bear had paid its respects to Thomas Reynolds, not as a wild animal, but as a living testament to the love and compassion that had been shown to it all those years ago. As the bear continued to stand by the coffin, the mourners were still reeling from the surreal encounter. The air had shifted from one of confusion and fear to something else, something almost sacred. The bear's presence, its quiet mourning, had brought a sense of peace to the funeral, as though nature itself had acknowledged the loss. But just as the mourners began to process what had just happened, the bear did something entirely unexpected, a gesture that would forever be etched in their memories. The bear, having spent a few moments in quiet contemplation, lifted its head and took a single step back. It paused, standing there for what seemed like an eternity, before it looked toward the crowd of mourners. Its eyes, dark and heavy with emotion, scanned each person, making direct eye contact with those closest to the coffin. It wasn't threatening, but its gaze was piercing, as if it was communicating something far beyond human understanding. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the bear was waiting for something. The mourners stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Some of them held their breath, others gripped the hands of their loved ones. The silence that hung in the air was nearly tangible, as if the entire forest had gone quiet to witness the moment. Then, in a move that took everyone by surprise, the bear did something that no one could have predicted. It reached down with its powerful paws and gently touched the edge of the coffin. The large, rough paw, capable of great destruction, was now placed tenderly on the wood, as though it were honoring the man who had once saved it. The sight was profound. This wild animal, known for its strength and ferocity, showing such care and gentleness in its final moments with Thomas. The mourners watched in stunned silence, their fear now completely replaced by awe. The bear's action wasn't one of aggression or domination. It was a simple, unspoken tribute, a gesture that conveyed more emotion than words ever could. The bear had come to offer its respect, And now, with this act, it was acknowledging the man who had been a protector, a savior. There was something deeply humbling about the way the bear had lowered itself, not just physically, but emotionally, to honor the memory of Thomas Reynolds. The grandmother, her eyes filled with tears, finally broke the silence. She whispered, her voice trembling, "It remembers." She wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but her words were filled with realization. The bear wasn't just a creature of instinct. It had remembered Thomas. It had recognized him and had come to pay homage, just as a human might do for a loved one. In that moment, the bear's unexpected action shifted everything. It transformed the funeral from a somber occasion into something transcendent. The bear was no longer just a wild animal. It was a symbol of the deep and inexplicable connections that can exist between humans and animals. This connection, rooted in kindness, in acts of selflessness, and in shared moments of vulnerability, had bridged the gap between species. And as the bear slowly withdrew its paw from the coffin and took a step back, the mourners knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a final act of love and respect that transcended all boundaries of nature. With a last look at the coffin, the bear turned and walked back into the forest, leaving behind a funeral that would never be forgotten. The bear's unexpected action had left the mourners in a daze, standing still as if frozen in time. The air around them had taken on an ethereal quality, charged with something unspoken, a silent understanding that no one could have predicted. As the bear made its way back into the depths of the forest, the mourners stood in complete silence. The entire moment felt like a fleeting dream, something they would struggle to explain, but would never forget. Yet, in the minds of those present, the flashbacks began to play like a reel of memories. For a few, the sight of the bear's gentle act of respect brought to mind a memory that had been hidden away in the quiet recesses of their minds. This was a bond forged years ago, long before the bear had stood at Thomas's funeral. The bond between Thomas and the bear had been one built over time, shaped by quiet acts of kindness and patience. It all started one crisp autumn morning when Thomas was walking through the forest near his cabin. The trees stood tall, their leaves painted in shades of gold and orange, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of damp wood and moss. The woods were quiet that day, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of fallen leaves. As Thomas walked along the edge of a river, he noticed something unusual. A small bear cub, no more than a few months old, was struggling in the fast-moving current of the river. The cub's tiny limbs flailed helplessly as the water pulled it further downstream. Thomas's heart immediately raced as he realized the danger the cub was in. Without thinking, he rushed into the cold water, determined to save the little creature. The current was strong, and the water chilled Thomas to the bone, but his focus was entirely on the cub. He reached out with steady hands, grabbing hold of the trembling bear and pulling it to safety. His strength and experience with the forest allowed him to steady the cub, who was weak from the struggle. Thomas carried the animal back to his cabin, cradling it gently, mindful of its fragility. Over the next few weeks, Thomas tended to the bear's wounds and cared for it as best as he could. He didn't know exactly how to care for a wild animal, but he had an instinct for compassion and patience. He fed the cub small amounts of food and kept it warm by the fire. Slowly, the cub began to regain its strength. The bond between man and animal was forged in those quiet days, a bond built on trust and mutual understanding. The cub would curl up beside Thomas's hearth, resting its head against his leg, and Thomas would run his hand gently through its fur, comforting it as it had never been comforted before. But as the days went on, it became clear that the cub would soon outgrow its dependence on Thomas. As much as he had grown attached to the animal, he knew it couldn't stay in the cabin forever. It was a wild creature, and one day it would need to return to the forest. He began taking the bear on walks through the woods, showing it the vastness of the world beyond the small cabin. He showed it where to find berries, how to fish in the stream, and how to navigate the dense forest. It was as though he was teaching the bear how to be a bear again. Though the bear was growing stronger and more independent with each passing day, it never forgot the man who had saved it. As the seasons changed and the cub grew into a majestic, powerful creature, it would still return to Thomas's cabin, often standing just outside the window, its large eyes watching the man inside. Thomas never saw the bear as a threat. He knew that the animal was still connected to him in some way, even if it had returned to the wild. And Thomas, for his part, continued to watch over the bear, even if from a distance. The connection between them had deepened, unspoken, yet undeniable. The bear had learned how to survive on its own, but it never forgot the kindness and care it had received from Thomas. And Thomas had learned the value of patience and understanding, of caring for a creature without expecting anything in return. As the years passed, the bear became a powerful presence in the forest, and Thomas aged gracefully, living his life in quiet solitude. Though their paths often diverged, the bond between them remained unbroken. The bear would occasionally visit, always leaving behind a trail of paw prints in the soft earth, reminding Thomas that the connection they shared had never been severed. Now, standing at Thomas's funeral, the mourners could only speculate how the bear had known that Thomas had passed. Was it instinct? Or perhaps it was the unspoken bond between them that had drawn the bear back to the place where its life had been saved. No one knew for sure. But what was clear to those who witnessed the bear's tribute was that the bond between Thomas and the bear was more than just a chance encounter. It was something deeper, a connection that defied logic and reason, a reminder that the language of love and compassion could transcend the boundaries of species. As the bear disappeared back into the forest, the mourners were left to reflect on the remarkable nature of this bond. It was a bond that had stood the test of time, a bond that had bridged the gap between man and beast. It was a bond that had shown them all the power of kindness, of loyalty, and of respect. And though Thomas was no longer there to witness it, the bear's tribute spoke volumes about the lasting impact one life could have on another, no matter how different those lives may be. The bear's departure was as quiet and dignified as its arrival. With one final look at the coffin, the majestic creature turned away and made its way into the dense forest, its large form slowly blending into the shadows. The mourners, still stunned by the whole experience, stood in silence, each person deeply moved by the powerful display of emotion they had just witnessed. It was as if time had momentarily stopped, allowing them to truly understand the bond between man and animal, a bond that transcended words and logic. As the bear vanished into the trees, the wind seemed to change, picking up slightly as if carrying with it the weight of the moment. The mourners felt a shift in the atmosphere, an unspoken connection between the man they had lost and the wild animal that had paid its respects. There was an almost sacred quality to the moment, as though nature itself had joined in mourning, honoring a life that had been touched by both kindness and wildness. For the widow, standing near the coffin, there was a deep sense of peace that washed over her. She had always known that her husband, Thomas, had a special connection with nature, but seeing the bear's respectful tribute left her with a profound sense of closure. It was as though the bear had come to remind everyone of the love and compassion that had defined Thomas's life. The bear had not come to mourn as humans did, but to offer its own unique form of tribute, one that spoke directly to the heart. The young boy, still clutching the framed photograph of his grandfather, looked on with wide eyes. He had never seen anything like this in his life. The image of the bear, standing solemnly before the coffin, was seared into his memory, forever tied to the image of his grandfather's funeral. For him, the memory would be both mysterious and comforting, a reminder that there was more to the world than what could be seen with the eyes. The bond between Thomas and the bear was a testament to the idea that love and respect were universal, shared by all living beings, regardless of their differences. As the family and friends began to slowly disperse, the realization began to settle in. The bear had offered its final goodbye in a way that words could never convey. The mourners had witnessed something extraordinary, something that had shifted their perspective on grief, loss, and the connections that tie all life together. The bear had not only honored Thomas's life, but had also reminded them of the importance of kindness, compassion, and the deep, sometimes mysterious ties that exist between humans and the natural world. Later that evening, as the sun began to set and the last rays of light slipped below the horizon, the widow sat alone by the fire in her cabin, reflecting on the day's events. The silence was comforting, broken only by the occasional crackle of the flames. She thought of Thomas, his gentle nature, his love for the forest, and the quiet moments they had shared together. And now, she thought of the bear, how it had come to honor her husband, just as it had once been saved by him. In that moment, she realized that Thomas had lived a life of quiet but profound meaning, a life that had left an impact far beyond what anyone had imagined. The bear's final goodbye, though brief, had carried with it a message that would stay with the widow forever, that love, kindness, and respect never truly end. They linger silently in the hearts of those who share them. The bear had come not just to mourn, but to acknowledge the lasting imprint that one soul can leave on the world, no matter how fleeting its presence may seem. In the years that followed, the story of the bear at Thomas Reynolds' funeral would become a local legend. It would be told and retold, each time more fantastical than the last, but the essence of the story would remain the same. The remarkable bond between a man and a bear, a bond that defied the natural order and spoke to something deeper within all living creatures. It would serve as a reminder of the profound impact that compassion and kindness can have, not only on the lives of humans, but also on the lives of animals, nature, and the world at large. And so, the bear's final act of tribute would live on, not just in the memories of those who had witnessed it, but in the hearts of all who heard the story, a testament to the beauty of life's connections, however unexpected they may be. The bear's final act of tribute, though brief, carried with it a profound lesson, one that reverberated through the hearts of those who witnessed it and echoed in the quiet corners of the world beyond. It was a lesson about the strength of compassion, the depth of bonds that can form between humans and animals, and the undeniable power of kindness to transcend all boundaries. In life, we often think of connections in terms of the obvious: family, friends, communities. We measure relationships by their simplicity or complexity, by the words we share, or the time we spend together. But what this story of Thomas and the bear taught the mourners was that the most meaningful connections can often defy explanation. The bear had not been taught to mourn in human terms. It had not been trained to show respect for the dead, nor had it been asked to do so. Yet, it came to the funeral not out of obligation, but out of a deep, instinctive respect, a silent acknowledgement of the kindness that had been shown to it years before. The lesson here is that kindness, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can have a lasting impact. Thomas had saved the bear when it was vulnerable, and in turn, the bear honored him in his final moments. This simple, yet profound act of kindness bridged the gap between species and brought the forest into the heart of human sorrow. It reminded the mourners that love and compassion are not limited by the constraints of human understanding, but are universal forces that exist in all living beings. Furthermore, the story reminds us of the fragility and beauty of life. Death is inevitable, and loss is a part of the human experience. But in our grief, we often fail to see the ways in which the lives we touch continue to affect the world long after we're gone. Thomas may have been just one man, living quietly in the woods, but his kindness had rippled outwards, touching the life of an animal and leaving an imprint on the hearts of everyone who learned of his story. The bear's tribute was not just for Thomas. It was a reminder that the legacy of goodness lives on, even when we are no longer here to witness it. For those who stood at the funeral, the experience was a turning point, a chance to reflect on their own lives and the ways in which they might make a difference in the world. It challenged them to think about the connections they had formed, both with people and with the natural world around them. It reminded them that every act of kindness, whether seen or unseen, has the power to create a ripple effect that can transcend time and space. The bear had come not only to honour Thomas, but to teach the mourners that the most important connections are those that are based on love, respect, and the simple, unspoken bonds that tie us all together. In the years that followed, the story of Thomas and the bear continued to be told, passed down from one generation to the next. And as the tale was shared, its message remained clear. Kindness is never wasted. Whether it is shown to a fellow human being, a stranger, or even an animal, it creates an impact far beyond what we can see. The bear's final goodbye was not just a farewell. It was a powerful reminder of the enduring nature of compassion and the extraordinary ways in which love can manifest in the world. And so, as we look at our own lives, let us remember the lesson that Thomas and the bear have taught us. Let us strive to live with kindness, to show respect to all living creatures, and to recognize the profound connections that exist beyond the surface. For in the end, it is these quiet acts of love and understanding that leave the most lasting legacy.